I remember the heat clinging to my uniform like a second skin. It wasn't the moist, familiar heat of the Atlantic coast where I grew up, but a dry, abrasive furnace that baked the breath right out of my lungs. I was thousands of miles from the familiar scent of salt air and pine, stuck in a landscape defined by monotonous beige and the constant, dull roar of jet engines. I was Lieutenant Sarah, Navy logistics officer, and my life here was a rigid, predictable sequence of drills, spreadsheets, and mandated downtime. Discipline was my shield. It had to be. Deployment strips you down to your most basic functions, leaving no room for the messy complexities of civilian life. I focused on the logistics of moving supplies, on the perfect alignment of my boots, on the cold, rational mathematics of keeping an operation running smoothly. This hyper-focus was a necessary defense against the nagging, insidious loneliness of being so far away. My father was the counterweight to all that structure, my quiet anchor. He was the reason I could tolerate the distance. He was always just a phone call away, a constant voice of calm in my fragmented military existence. He never asked me when I was coming home. He simply told me he was proud of the work I was doing, and that was enough. Those weekly calls were my lifeline, the one connection that reminded me there was a solid, loving foundation waiting for me beneath the shifting sands. I was running a routine inventory check in a sweltering warehouse, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel and packing grease, when the runner found me. He was young, nervous, and avoided my gaze, which was unusual. "Lieutenant," he stammered, holding out a sealed folder. "The commander needs you in his office, immediately." I felt a sudden, inexplicable tightening in my chest, the kind of professional dread that precedes a major operational failure. I signed for the folder, tucked it under my arm, and started the long walk across the tarmac. The sun beat down, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirage, but I barely noticed the heat. My mind was already running scenarios, calculating potential risks. When I entered the commander's office, the air conditioning felt shockingly cold against my sweat-dampened uniform. The room was sterile, organized, and utterly silent. Commander Davies stood behind his enormous, uncluttered mahogany desk. He didn't offer me a seat, and he didn't offer a preamble. I saw the look on his face instantly. It was the look they reserve for news that can't be fixed by strategy or logistics. It was the look of unavoidable human tragedy. He cleared his throat, his professional demeanor momentarily failing him. "Lieutenant, I have received communication from the States. I am deeply sorry to tell you this." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Your father, Mr. Robert Hayes, passed away suddenly this morning. The world didn't stop turning, but my internal gyroscope shattered. The crushing weight of the heat, the constant noise of the base, the rigid structure of my life, all of it dissolved into a buzzing, formless void. I heard the commander's words, but they didn't penetrate the wall of shock that instantly encased me. Gone. The word was too small, too mundane for the devastation it described. My father, my steadfast, quiet anchor, was simply gone. I didn't cry. The grief was a physical phenomenon, not an emotional one, crushing the air from my lungs and making my knees weak. I gripped the edge of the commander's desk, needing the support to remain upright. My first thought, selfishly, was the unbearable guilt of distance. I was thousands of miles away, focused on crates and manifests, while he died alone. I hadn't been there. I hadn't heard his voice this morning. The thought was a sharp, internal scream that I had to swallow back down. Commander Davies continued, his voice softer now, outlining the protocol for emergency leave, bereavement travel, and counseling resources. I nodded mechanically, processing the logistics even as my heart felt like it was being squeezed dry. My second thought, shamefully, was Veronica. Veronica was the complication I had successfully avoided for the last 3 years of my deployment. She was 20 years younger than Dad, a vision of polished, superficial beauty, interested only in the prestige and the security his name and wealth provided. She'd swept into his life during his vulnerable late 60s, filling the house with loud laughter and designer labels, erasing the quiet dignity my mother had cultivated. I had tolerated her, barely, understanding that Dad was lonely, but I never trusted her. Not for a second. I dreaded the return home. It wasn't just the funeral, the overwhelming finality of burying the man who raised me. It was the inevitable, cold confrontation with her. I knew she would turn his death into a performance, a spectacle of manufactured grief designed to garner sympathy and, more importantly, control. I spent the next agonizing 24 hours in a blur of paperwork, securing my emergency leave and coordinating travel back to the States. I tried calling the family lawyer, Mr. Peterson, but his office was closed. I assumed he was already handling the initial arrangements, probably coordinating with Veronica. I was sitting in my cramped, sterile quarters, staring blankly at the map on my wall, a map of impossible distances, when the phone rang. It wasn't a familiar number. I answered with my standard, crisp military greeting. Lieutenant Hayes. The voice on the other end was formal, precise, and immediately unsettling. It wasn't Mr. Peterson. Lieutenant Hayes, this is Lieutenant Commander Hayes. JAG Corps, Office of the Chief Counsel. I apologize for contacting you under these circumstances. A Navy JAG officer? Why was the Judge Advocate General's Corps calling me about a civilian matter? My professional alarm bells began to clang. Commander, I responded, my voice tightening. I appreciate the call, but I'm currently processing emergency leave regarding my father's passing. I'm coordinating with the family's civilian counsel. Yes, Lieutenant, that is precisely why I am calling. His tone was measured, betraying nothing. Mr. Peterson has been trying to reach you. However, certain complications have arisen regarding the estate and the execution of the will. Due to your active duty status and the nature of some of the assets involved, the JAG office was notified. Complications. The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. It was a term used to describe things that were deliberately messy, not accidentally difficult. What kind of complications, Commander? I demanded, the grief momentarily eclipsed by a surge of cold, professional suspicion. My military training kicked in. I needed facts, not emotion. He hesitated, a tiny, almost imperceptible pause that spoke volumes. Lieutenant, your civilian counsel found himself in a difficult position. It appears your stepmother, Veronica Hayes, executed a new will shortly after your father's passing. My heart turned to ice. I felt a dizzying wave of nausea. After? Commander, that's impossible. My father died this morning. She couldn't execute his will after he was deceased. Not his will, Lieutenant. A new will, drafted and signed by him, but executed, or rather, revealed, under highly questionable circumstances immediately following the pronouncement of death. Mr. Peterson believes it may supersede all previous documents. He is concerned about your legal standing and, frankly, the speed with which this was handled. The blood drained from my face. This wasn't about grief anymore. This wasn't about a trophy wife inheriting a reasonable amount of comfort. This was about calculated, predatory theft. Veronica hadn't waited for the body to cool. She had moved like a viper, striking the moment Dad's protector status was gone. I realized then that this wasn't just a painful family matter. It was war. A legal, financial war launched against me while I was deployed, unable to defend myself or my father's legacy. Commander, I said, my voice now perfectly level, stripped of all emotion. Thank you for the notification. I will be stateside in less than 48 hours. Please forward all relevant documentation to my secure military email immediately. I want everything Mr. Peterson has and everything your office has flagged. Understood, Lieutenant. We will be tracking your situation closely. I hung up the phone and stared at my reflection in the dark window pane. My eyes were hard, my mouth set in a thin, determined line. The shock of my father's death was still a raw wound, but the immediate, sharp pain of betrayal had cauterized the emotional bleeding. I secured my leave, my focus shifting instantly and completely. I was no longer just a mourning daughter flying home for a funeral. I was a military officer returning to hostile territory to fight for everything my father had ever held dear: the home he loved, the security he had built, and the integrity of his final wishes. I walked to my locker, not to retrieve civilian clothes, but to retrieve my dress uniform. I meticulously checked the creases, polished the brass, and packed my gear with the same calculated precision I would use preparing for a forward deployment. I wasn't going home to bury my father. I was going home to fight a battle for the stolen anchor of my life. Veronica had made her move, thinking I would be too broken by grief, too distracted by distance, or too constrained by military life to fight back. She was wrong. I was coming, and I was bringing my training with me. The war had just begun. The recycled air of the commercial flight felt thin, a sterile contrast to the diesel-laced desert heat I had left behind just hours ago. I was wearing civilian clothes, a muted gray suit that felt foreign after months in rough-spun khaki, but the discipline of the uniform was still etched into my spine. Every nerve ending was taut, not with the anticipation of a combat zone, but with the specific, suffocating dread of returning to a life irrevocably broken. I landed in the States feeling fundamentally disoriented. The humidity hit me first, thick and clinging, smelling of rain and cut grass, the familiar, comforting scent of my home state, thousands of miles and a lifetime away from the dry grit of the Middle East. I didn't waste time. I bypassed the baggage carousel, carrying only my military-issue duffel bag, which held my essentials and the heavy weight of my grief. My focus was singular: get to the house. The drive was a blur of lush green landscapes and overly cheerful billboards. Each mile brought me closer to the physical manifestation of my father's life, and closer to the inevitable encounter with Veronica. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, channeling the churning nausea in my gut into a cold, tactical calm. Observe. Assess. Engage. That was the mantra I clung to. I turned onto the familiar street, the one lined with towering oaks whose branches formed a tunnel overhead. I remembered riding my bike here, Dad teaching me how to change a tire in the driveway, the sound of the ocean faint but constant in the background. My heart, which had been numb since the commander's terrible news, began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I pulled into the curb across the street, expecting the house, the ancestral home, the anchor of my childhood, to stand sentinel, perhaps draped in the silent respect of recent mourning. What I saw instead stopped my breath entirely. The front door was closed and locked, yes, but the lawn was too immaculate, the windows too blank. And planted squarely in the center of the meticulously manicured grass, like a flag planted on conquered territory, was a large, aggressive sign: for sale, exclusive listing. The air rushed out of my lungs, leaving me hollowed out and shaking. It wasn't just that the house was for sale, it was the speed, the brazen lack of decency. My father had been gone less than 2 weeks, and already Veronica was monetizing his memory. She hadn't waited for the funeral, hadn't waited for me to even step foot back on American soil. She had moved with the swift, predatory efficiency of a vulture. I sat there, staring at the sign, feeling the cold fury rise from my boots up into my skull. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was a calculated, devastating act of erasure. The house wasn't just property. It was the repository of every memory I had of my mother and father. She was selling not bricks and mortar, but my history. I drove around the block slowly, confirming the locked gates and the empty garage. She wasn't here. She had already abandoned the scene of the crime. My immediate impulse was to pound on the door, to rip the sign out of the ground, to demand answers. But the years of military training asserted themselves, forcing me into a strategic pause. Anger was a liability. Hysteria was defeat. I needed information, not confrontation. I needed to know where she was and what her next move would be. I checked into a sterile, anonymous hotel room near the downtown district. I didn't unpack. I simply changed into a fresh, crisp white shirt and tailored trousers, the closest I could get to a uniform without actually wearing my dress blues. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. It took 2 hours, leveraging a few old contacts and using my innate ability to sound authoritative and insistent, but I found her. Veronica wasn't grieving quietly at home. She was at the Gilded Cage, the most exclusive, overpriced restaurant in the city, known for its champagne list and its clientele who valued ostentation over subtlety. I arrived at the restaurant, the weight of my father's loss pressing down on me, sharpened now by the edge of cold determination. The host, a man whose tailored suit looked far too expensive for his job, tried to stop me politely at the velvet rope. "I'm sorry, ma'am, do you have a reservation? We're fully booked." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my wallet and produced my military identification, holding it just close enough for him to read the rank and the stern official seal. My eyes were level and unwavering. "I am Lieutenant Sarah Jensen. I need to speak to Veronica Jensen. It's a family emergency that requires immediate attention." The word lieutenant, combined with the severity of my expression, seemed to pierce the host's practiced indifference. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking from my ID to the quiet authority in my posture. He didn't ask another question. He simply nodded and led me through the hushed, cavernous dining room. The atmosphere inside was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, truffle oil, and money. It was loud, but with the controlled, brittle laughter of the elite. And then I saw her. Veronica was seated at a prime table near the enormous arched window, draped in a shimmering black dress that was clearly brand new. Her hair was freshly styled, and her neck glittered with a diamond necklace I had never seen before. A substantial piece that screamed, "recent acquisition." She was sipping a flute of champagne, her head tilted back, laughing loudly at something the man across from her had said. She looked triumphant, radiant, and utterly untouched by sorrow. When the host discreetly whispered in her ear and gestured toward me, her laughter died instantly. Her eyes, usually wide and artless, narrowed as they tracked my approach. The transition from manufactured joy to sharp annoyance was instantaneous, like flipping a switch. I walked directly to the table and stood there, saying nothing, allowing my quiet presence and my tailored attire to act as a stark contrast to her excessive display. "Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, the sound grating on my nerves. She placed her champagne flute down with a delicate clink. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer the question. I simply stated the facts. I just arrived from overseas. I went to the house. I saw the sign. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched slightly. "Oh, that. Yes, well, the market is hot right now, dear. And frankly, that old place was a money pit. The maintenance alone was astronomical. It was Dad's home," I stated, my voice dangerously even. "It was the only home I've ever known." She waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a persistent fly. "Nostalgia doesn't pay the property taxes, Sarah. Your father and I discussed it. He wanted me to be comfortable. We need to talk about the estate," I pressed, ignoring her casual cruelty. "I need to see the will. I need to know the status of the accounts." She smiled then, a cold, shark-like flash of white teeth. "Oh, we can talk, darling, but you're too late." She signaled the waiter for another glass of champagne, deliberately making me wait. The man across from her, a slick-looking individual who was clearly her lawyer or a new associate, shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden, sharp tension. "Your father was very clear," Veronica continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, lowering her voice just enough so that the surrounding diners couldn't hear the specifics of her malice. "He changed everything. He wanted me to enjoy my life, and I am." "What exactly did he change?" I asked, feeling a terrible, hollow dread settle in my stomach. She took a long, slow sip of champagne, savoring the moment of devastating revelation. "The house is sold, already under contract. The investment accounts were liquidated last week, per his instructions. Everything, Sarah. All of it. Gone." The word "gone" echoed in the silent space between us, a physical blow. She had not just inherited, she had systematically emptied his legacy. The speed of her actions suggested not just greed, but a calculated fear that I would return and challenge her. I don't believe that, I whispered, the humiliation burning hot in my cheeks. My father would never have done that to me, not without talking to me. Well, he did, she countered, her voice now flat and devoid of the saccharine facade. He changed his mind. And frankly, Lieutenant, you were thousands of miles away playing soldier. He needed someone here, taking care of him, someone who deserved it. She reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a thin, folded piece of paper, a document that looked flimsy and carelessly handled. She tossed it onto the table, right next to the breadbasket. There, the new will, everything to me, executed just days before his passing. Now, if you'll excuse me, you're ruining my dinner. I picked up the document. It was a hastily drafted piece of legal boilerplate, signed with a shaky hand that barely resembled my father's normally firm signature. It was a slap in the face, a crude, unforgivable insult to his memory and my entire future. I looked at Veronica one last time. Her eyes were hard, triumphant. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought this flimsy piece of paper, backed by her expensive jewelry and her casual ruthlessness, was the end of the matter. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I folded the document carefully, placing it into my pocket, the sharp creases digging into my palm. The military discipline kicked in fully now, overriding the broken heart. Emotionally, I was shattered, but strategically, I was crystal clear. Veronica wanted chaos. I would bring order. She wanted a shouting match. I would bring a meticulous investigation. I turned and walked out of the gilded cage without a backward glance, leaving her to her champagne and her ill-gotten gains. I drove back to the sterile hotel room, the silence of the car punctuated only by the pounding clarity of my new mission. She had money and lawyers who valued billable hours over integrity. But she had made several critical mistakes. She had acted too quickly, she had been too obvious, and most importantly, she had underestimated the resolve of a commissioned naval officer. I spread the few papers I had managed to gather, the will, the realtor's card, a few old financial statements, across the hotel desk, treating the flimsy laminate surface like a mission planning table. I began sketching a timeline, looking for the single tiny crack in her armor, the moment where her narrative of a loving husband changing his mind fractured under the weight of evidence. I knew exactly who to call. I needed professional help, official leverage, and the kind of legal mind that wasn't afraid to challenge established wealth. I picked up the phone and dialed the number of the Navy JAG officer, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the man whose initial, ominous warning had brought me home. When he answered, his voice was professional and guarded. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes, this is Lieutenant Sarah Jensen. I'm in the States. I've confirmed my worst fears. She has liquidated everything and produced a fraudulent will." I paused, taking a steadying breath. I didn't need sympathy. I needed a partner. "Commander, I need help finding the evidence of fraud. I need to know the legal route to invalidate that document and recover my father's assets. This stops now. I'm ready to fight." My deployment might have been over, but the war for my father's memory had just entered its active phase. Veronica thought she was untouchable because she had the cash. But I had the training, I had the truth, and now I had the Navy's legal resources backing me up. I was going to find that crack, and when I did, I would shatter her entire operation. The silence in the sterile, temporary apartment I rented felt heavier than the desert heat I had just left behind. I had spread the few boxes of my father's remaining papers across the cheap Formica table, transforming the space into a makeshift command center. My deployment might have been over, but the war for my father's memory had just entered its active phase. Veronica thought she was untouchable because she had the cash and the expensive legal muscle. But I had the training, I had the truth, and now I had Lieutenant Commander Hayes. I called Hayes the morning after the confrontation with Veronica. He listened patiently as I recounted the details, the sudden sale of the house, the liquidated accounts, the flimsy, hastily drafted will she had thrown at me. His response was measured, devoid of the shock that normally accompanies such brazen theft, yet brimming with professional intensity. Lieutenant, Hayes said, his voice crackling slightly over the secure line. We need to treat this as an intelligence operation. Veronica's strategy relies on volume and intimidation. Our strategy relies on precision and exposing the timeline. He laid out the legal landscape during our first formal meeting in a small, windowless conference room at the local JAG office. The atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the polished mahogany and expansive views of the civilian firms Veronica had hired. Hayes was young, sharp, and wore the quiet dedication of a career naval officer. We are fighting a battle of attrition, Sarah, he explained, using my first name only when discussing strategy. She has unlimited resources to flood us with motions and delays. We need one piece of evidence, one undeniable fact, that shifts the burden of proof entirely onto her. We are aiming for undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. That means proving your father wasn't sound of mind, or that she coerced him. The initial legal meetings were brutal. I accompanied Hayes to the first discovery hearing, a necessary evil where we met Veronica's legal team face to face. They were exactly as I had imagined, slick, tailored, and condescending. The lead counsel, a man named Sterling who looked like he spent more time on the golf course than in court, barely acknowledged me. Lieutenant, Sterling drawled, his voice dripping with false civility. We understand this is an emotional time, and the loss of inheritance is difficult. However, your father's final wishes were clear. We suggest you focus on your military career and avoid sinking taxpayer dollars into a frivolous challenge. I felt the immense pressure of their resources, the weight of their confidence that they could simply outspend me until I gave up. They treated me like a uniformed nuisance, an overseas officer who couldn't possibly afford to challenge their comprehensive defense. I didn't engage. My training demanded I maintain a professional distance, observing their weaknesses rather than reacting to their taunts. I saw the arrogance in Sterling's eyes, the certainty that money was the only metric of justice. Hayes countered their dismissal with cold, concise requests for documentation, focusing specifically on the financial transactions and, crucially, my father's medical records for the 6 months preceding his death. We need the paper trail, Sarah, Hayes reiterated as we left the meeting. Veronica is not subtle. She moves fast. That speed is her weakness. We need to find where she cut corners. The next few weeks became a grueling exercise in meticulous intelligence gathering. I took emergency leave and dedicated every waking hour to the case. I treated the stacks of documentation, bank statements, insurance policies, and prescription logs, like classified operational intelligence. I established a massive, color-coded timeline on the wall of my temporary living quarters, charting every significant event. Dad's last birthday, Veronica's sudden trip to the lawyer, the date the will was signed, and the subsequent rapid liquidation of assets. My military discipline kicked in. This was familiar territory. On deployment, I managed logistics for thousands of personnel. Sifting through paper to find a single crucial anomaly was just a different kind of mission. I used spreadsheets to cross-reference dates, looking for any deviation from my father's established routines. The financial records were infuriating but predictable. Large sums were transferred out of long-held investment accounts immediately after the will was executed. The ancestral home was sold below market value to an LLC that was, unsurprisingly, linked to one of Veronica's friends. Everything pointed to premeditation and greed. But the fraud needed to be tied directly to the signing of the will. And that meant the medical records. The hospital and clinic records were dense and often frustratingly vague. My father, a man who hated doctors, had only a few routine visits in the months leading up to his death. I pored over the physician's notes, focusing on the weeks immediately surrounding the date Veronica claimed Dad signed the new will. I started small, focusing on the dates surrounding the signing. The will was dated October 12th. I had already confirmed with Hayes that the document was notarized hastily in a small, obscure office outside of our home county. A clear attempt to avoid scrutiny from Dad's longtime trusted attorney. I worked late into the night, the only sound the hum of the cheap refrigerator and the scratch of my pen circling dates. Reading those records was painful. Each note, detailing a symptom or a complaint, was a stark reminder of the quiet suffering he endured while I was thousands of miles away, focused on my own duty. The guilt was a constant, low-level ache. Then I found it. It wasn't in the primary physician's file, but tucked away in a specialist's consultation report. A neurologist Dad had seen for what Veronica had dismissed as a little forgetfulness. The date jumped out at me. October 9th, 3 days before the will was executed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I read the note again, slowly, trying to absorb the clinical language. The physician had charted patient presence with marked short-term memory deficits, observed signs of significant cognitive impairment, occasional disorientation regarding time and place, particularly during stress interviews. Recommend immediate follow-up and comprehensive psychological evaluation. I felt a sudden rush of adrenaline mixed with devastating heartbreak. My father, my steadfast anchor, was vulnerable. He wasn't in his right mind when he supposedly signed away his entire legacy and my future. Veronica hadn't just manipulated him, she had ruthlessly exploited his declining mental state, rushing him to sign before the impairment became officially documented and undeniable. I stared at the note, the thin paper feeling monumental in my hand. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't interpretation. This was a clinical finding, dated just 72 hours before she forced his hand. It was the crack I had been looking for. I immediately shared the discovery with Hayes. I emailed him the scanned copy, highlighting the crucial lines. I was shaking, not from fear, but from the sudden cold clarity of justice. Hayes called me back within minutes. His professional calm was slightly fractured by urgency. "Sarah," he said, the respect in his voice amplified. "This changes everything. This isn't just a dispute anymore. This is prima facie evidence of fraud. We have the medical documentation establishing lack of testamentary capacity, and we have the timeline of her immediate aggressive liquidation. She acted fast because she knew this report existed." Hayes moved with the efficiency of a guided missile. He immediately secured an affidavit from the neurologist who had written the note, confirming the severity of my father's condition at the time of the examination. This evidence, the timeline discrepancy paired with the medical documentation, was the leverage we needed. It shifted the entire legal argument from a simple, expensive inheritance dispute to a case of elder manipulation and potential criminal fraud. Veronica's expensive lawyers could argue about my father's affection for her all they wanted, but they couldn't argue with a doctor's chart. "We file the motion to invalidate tomorrow morning," Hayes told me. "We are citing undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. We are demanding the immediate freezing of all assets she acquired through the sale of the house and liquidation of the accounts." I walked over to my makeshift command center and looked at the wall, now covered in notes and timelines. The military discipline had served me well, transforming my grief into focused action. But now, looking at the medical note again, I felt a surge of protective, visceral anger, not just the disciplined anger of an officer seeking justice, but the fierce, raw anger of a daughter who had just seen proof of her father's betrayal. Veronica had underestimated my resolve, and she had certainly underestimated the meticulousness required to cover her tracks completely. She thought she had won because she had the money, but I had my training, and now I had the truth. We were heading into open court, and I knew I had a weapon she didn't anticipate, the ghost of my father's declining health, speaking from the records. This stops now. We were going to war. The air in the courtroom was thick, a suffocating blend of old dust, polished oak, and the sharp metallic tang of nervous anticipation. I had arrived before dawn, long before the clerks unlocked the heavy doors, needing the silence to fortify myself. This was not a theater of operations where strategy was drawn on a map. This was a war fought on paper and through testimony, but the stakes felt just as high, perhaps higher, because this battle was for my past. I wore my dress uniform, the crisp white and navy blue a deliberate choice. It was my armor, a statement of integrity against the glittering, manufactured facade Veronica was sure to present. I wanted the judge, the jury, if there had been one, though this was a probate matter, and most importantly, Veronica, to see that I was not just a grieving daughter, but an officer of the United States Navy, disciplined, focused, and dedicated to the truth. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, sharp and impeccable in his own uniform, met my eyes and offered a slight, encouraging nod. He understood the visual strategy. Against Veronica's expensive three-piece suits and tailored silk, we presented discipline and fact. The courtroom filled slowly. I watched the spectators, mostly older, curious observers from the local community who knew my father's name. Then the heavy doors opened again, and she swept in. Veronica. She was draped in black, expensive mourning attire that screamed wealth rather than sorrow. She was flanked by her legal cavalry, 3 lawyers, led by a man named Sterling, whose reputation for aggressive, scorched-earth tactics preceded him. She caught my eye across the aisle, and the patronizing smirk she offered was like a physical blow. She truly believed she had already won, that my military pay grade couldn't possibly sustain a fight against her endless stream of liquidity. The proceedings began with the gravitas of the judge's voice. Hayes started methodically, laying the groundwork of my father's life, his decades of community service, and his consistent, protective love for me. It was quiet, solid, foundational work. Then, the mood shifted. Hayes called Dr. Evans, my father's longtime primary care physician. Dr. Evans was frail, clearly uncomfortable in the witness box, but his testimony was devastatingly precise. Hayes walked him through the medical records I had meticulously uncovered. "Dr. Evans," Hayes asked, his voice calm, "can you confirm the date of the late Mr. Thomas's last comprehensive physical examination?" "Yes, Commander. It was October 12th. "And can you confirm the date that the new will, the one currently under dispute, was signed?" "October 15th, the doctor confirmed, consulting his notes. Hayes paused, letting the 3-day gap hang in the silence. "Doctor, on October 12th, during your examination, did you note any concerns regarding Mr. Thomas's cognitive state?" Dr. Evans sighed, looking genuinely distressed. "I did. The chart notes reflect initial signs of significant cognitive impairment. Mr. Thomas was disoriented regarding the date and seemed confused about his recent financial decisions. I recommended immediate neurological follow-up." A ripple went through the gallery. Veronica's composure, which had been frozen in perfect arrogance, began to thaw into something ugly. Her eyes darted toward Sterling, who immediately jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. The doctor is not a neurologist and is interpreting simple forgetfulness as impairment," Sterling roared, trying to drown out the doctor's words. "Overruled," the judge stated dryly. "The chart notes are admissible medical evidence. Proceed, Commander." Hayes looked back at Dr. Evans. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, given the disorientation and confusion noted just 3 days prior, do you believe Mr. Thomas possessed the full testamentary capacity, the clear, sound mind, required to understand and execute a complex legal document like a last will and testament on October 15th? Dr. Evans looked directly at the judge. "Based on my observation and notes from October 12th, I would have serious reservations about his capacity to fully grasp the ramifications of signing away his entire estate just 72 hours later. He was vulnerable." The word vulnerable hung in the air like smoke. I felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. This was the crack. This was the leverage. I watched Veronica's hands clench so tightly I thought her knuckles would break the skin. The mask was definitely gone, replaced by raw, defensive fear. Sterling's cross-examination was brutal, attempting to paint Dr. Evans as a doddering old practitioner out of his depth. But the doctor stood firm, relying on his written records, proving that the medical evidence was factual, not subjective. Then, it was my turn. I walked to the stand, taking the oath with the same solemnity I used when swearing to defend the Constitution. I sat straight, my back rigid, refusing to give Sterling any visual indication of weakness. Hayes led me gently, asking me to describe the house, the ancestral home, not as property, but as the repository of my father's life. I spoke about the worn floorboards, the smell of the ocean carried in on the breeze, the quiet Sunday mornings we shared. I let the truth of our relationship saturate the sterile courtroom. Lieutenant Sarah Thomas, Hayes continued, when you returned home on emergency leave, what was the first thing you observed about the property your father had cherished? My voice was steady, trained to project without shouting. I found a realtor's sign in the front yard. The locks had been changed. And what did you discover regarding your father's financial portfolio? It had been liquidated. All investment accounts were emptied. The speed of the liquidation was startling, occurring within days of his passing, before I could even finalize my travel arrangements. This was the critical pivot, linking the medical vulnerability to the predatory speed of Veronica's actions. When Sterling took over for the cross-examination, his tone was condescending, laced with implied accusation. "Lieutenant Thomas," he began, leaning toward me, trying to invade my personal space. "You are a commissioned officer, correct?" "I am, sir." "And you were deployed overseas, correct? Thousands of miles away from your father during his final months?" "I was deployed, fulfilling my professional obligations. Obligations that kept you from seeing your father, from checking on his medical state, from knowing the details of his life, correct?" He hammered the point, trying to establish my absence as neglect. "My father and I spoke every Sunday, sir. He was immensely proud of my service. I was not neglectful. I was deployed, fighting for this country. If you are suggesting that fulfilling my duties somehow invalidates my relationship with my father, I would respectfully disagree." My answer was delivered without heat, factual and firm. I looked him dead in the eye. He hadn't expected the rebuttal to be so direct or so rooted in my identity. He shifted tack, smelling blood. "Let's talk about money, Lieutenant. You are fighting for this inheritance, are you not? Because you believe you are entitled to a large sum of money? I am fighting, sir, for the integrity of my father's final wishes and against the fraudulent exploitation of an elderly man who was medically vulnerable. The money is secondary to the principle. Had my father been of sound mind and chosen to leave everything to charity, I would not be here today. I am here because my father was manipulated while he was failing. And you have a financial motive, do you not? You want the house and the accounts back for yourself. I want justice for my father. And yes, I want the assets that were meant to sustain the next chapter of my life. Assets that were stolen by someone who treated my father as a means to an end." I held my gaze, refusing to let the anger that simmered beneath my skin boil over. My military training was my anchor. It taught me to compartmentalize emotion and focus only on the objective. I was an intelligence officer now, reporting facts under fire. Sterling, frustrated by my lack of emotional breakdown, finally ceded the floor. The rest of the day was a blur of legal arguments, procedural motions, and the relentless presentation of evidence. By the time the judge recessed for the evening, the weight of the day felt crushing. The next morning, the judge delivered his preliminary ruling. He spoke quietly, measuredly, but his words were a thunderclap. He found that the evidence presented, particularly the medical documentation surrounding the signing date, strongly supported the claim of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. The hastily drafted, fraudulent will, the document Veronica had waved in my face at the restaurant, was officially invalidated. A collective gasp went up in the courtroom. Veronica's face was a mask of shock and fury. Sterling immediately requested a sidebar, his voice a frantic whisper to the judge. It was a massive, undeniable victory. But as Hayes and I gathered our papers, the initial exhilaration faded into a cold realization. We had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Hayes leaned in close as the judge announced the recess. "We knocked out the fraudulent will, Lieutenant. That's huge. But the money is still gone," I countered, the victory feeling hollow. "The house is sold. The accounts are liquidated. If the estate reverts to the previous decades-old will, she still inherits a significant portion, and getting those liquid assets back from her legal maneuvers will take years of litigation. She'll hide them, she'll spend them. This is a stalemate. Hayes looked grave, but then a flicker of something else, a calculated anticipation, appeared in his eyes. You're right. We've established her fraud. We've proven she's a predator who exploited your father's decline, Hayes whispered, his voice low enough to avoid the eavesdropping reporters. But that was only phase 1 of your father's plan. I frowned, confused. What are you talking about? What plan? Your father was a wise man, Sarah. He knew her kind. He knew what she was capable of doing the moment he was gone. He didn't rely on a simple will to protect you. Hayes paused, letting the tension build, then fixed me with a serious look. Now, we play the final card, Lieutenant. It's what your father wanted all along. I looked across the aisle. Veronica was now whispering angrily, venomously to Sterling, her face contorted with rage. She still believed she held the advantage because she still controlled the physical cash. She thought she could delay the restitution forever. She was about to learn that my father, the quiet anchor of my life, had prepared for this exact moment years ago, setting a trap that even her expensive legal team couldn't dismantle. I knew the next phase wouldn't just be about reclaiming money, it would be about delivering a final, absolute reckoning. I felt a renewed, fierce determination settle deep in my core. I was ready. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with the lingering scent of stale coffee and exhausted anticipation. Veronica, despite the judge's ruling that invalidated her hastily drafted document, still managed to project a brittle confidence. She was huddled with her legal team, whispering strategies, clearly believing that even if the new will was tossed, she could tie up the estate in years of litigation, keeping the millions liquid and inaccessible to me. She held the cash. She thought she held the power. I sat straighter in my chair, my dress uniform feeling heavy, but comforting. I knew my discipline had cracked her initial facade, but the real victory felt distant. Lieutenant Commander Hayes returned from the recess, not with the typical briskness of a lawyer ready to argue technicalities, but with a slow, deliberate gravity. He held a single, thick manila envelope against his chest. It looked old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. My gaze locked onto the envelope. I had reviewed every document related to my father's affairs countless times. Insurance policies, deeds, old stock certificates. I had never seen that envelope before. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Was this another complication? Another legal landmine? Hayes placed the envelope on the mahogany table before approaching the bench. His voice, usually sharp and penetrating, was measured now, carrying an unusual weight. Your Honor, he began, addressing the judge directly, while we have successfully demonstrated undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity regarding the document presented by the opposing counsel, we must now introduce evidence that supersedes all previously existing wills and probate documents. Veronica stopped whispering. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide and suddenly wary. I leaned forward, confusion warring with a sudden, wild hope. What was he doing? Hayes waited for the court recorder to confirm they were ready. He then carefully removed a document from the envelope. It wasn't a will, not in the traditional sense. The heading, printed in severe official typeface, read, Irrevocable Military Designation and Survivor Trust. The moment I saw the word military, a flash of understanding hit me. My father, a man who respected structure and procedure above all else, had anticipated the chaos. This trust, Hayes continued, his voice echoing slightly in the sudden silence, was established by the deceased, Captain Thomas E. Sterling, USN, Reti, 7 years ago. It was executed and filed not through civilian probate courts, but through the Department of Defense's legal channels, making it fully independent of state probate jurisdiction. The courtroom erupted into a low, frantic buzz. Veronica's lead counsel, Mr. Thorne, shot to his feet, objecting vehemently. Objection, Your Honor. This is entirely new evidence. It is inadmissible and clearly a desperate attempt to introduce a fabricated document after losing the primary argument. Hayes remained utterly calm. With respect, counsel, the document is dated and notarized. Furthermore, the provisions of this specific type of military trust are designed precisely to protect assets from manipulation in the event of incapacitation or undue influence, ensuring they pass directly to the named beneficiary upon the grantor's death. The judge silenced Thorne with a stern look, accepting the document for review. I watched the judge's face as he scanned the pages, his expression shifting from skepticism to deep concentration. The silence was the most profound I had ever experienced in that room. I could hear the sharp intake of breath from Veronica, who was now gripping the edge of her table so tightly her knuckles were white. Hayes explained the key provision, the one that made my father's final act so perfectly strategic. The trust stipulated that the entirety of Captain Sterling's liquid assets, including specific investment accounts and the ancestral home, held in a separate LLC, which was the trust's primary asset, were to be transferred to the sole beneficiary, Lieutenant Sarah Sterling, USN, upon the confirmation of Captain Sterling's death and the beneficiary's continued honorable service status. My father hadn't just left me money. He had built a fortress. He knew the civilian world was messy, but the military world was governed by ironclad rules. By using a military trust, he had placed his legacy under the protection of the very organization that defined my life. Hayes's next words sealed Veronica's fate. As the assets were irrevocably placed into this trust 7 years ago, they were never legally part of the probate estate at the time of Captain Sterling's death. Therefore, the subsequent actions of Mrs. Sterling to sell the home and liquidate the accounts were not merely attempts to manipulate an estate. They were actions taken against assets already legally designated to the trust, which is now legally obligated to pay out to Lieutenant Sterling. The implication was devastating. Veronica hadn't stolen my inheritance. She had stolen trust assets, a far more serious offense with criminal implications. Veronica let out a sound, a strangled, desperate gasp, that cut through the courtroom's tension. Her face was a terrifying mosaic of betrayal and panic. She looked at Thorne, who simply shook his head, defeated. They had wasted their resources fighting a fraudulent will, unaware that the true inheritance was moving along a parallel, unassailable track. The judge, having finished his review, looked up and spoke with definitive clarity. The court finds the irrevocable military designation and survivor trust to be valid and binding. The assets contained within, including the proceeds from the sale of the property located at 417 Ocean View Drive, are immediately due to the beneficiary, Lieutenant Sarah Sterling, he continued, addressing Veronica directly, his tone cold and unforgiving. Mrs. Sterling, you are hereby ordered to provide a full accounting of all liquidated assets and repay the full amount, including all lost interest and the current market value difference of the home, within 30 days. Furthermore, given the evidence of potential financial misconduct and the exploitation of a grantor with documented cognitive impairment, this court reserves the right to refer this matter to the relevant authorities for further investigation. It was over, not with a whimper of compromise, but with the resounding crack of absolute defeat. Veronica was ruined. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. The flood of emotion that hit me was not the triumph I expected, but a profound, overwhelming grief mixed with awe for my father. He had known. He had known her character, known her greed, and known that the only way to protect me was to leverage my own strength, my commitment to service. He hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had left me proof that he saw me, trusted my path, and built a final strategic defense around my future. Tears, hot and unstoppable, finally tracked down my cheeks. They weren't tears of anger or even relief, but of heartbroken love. I mourned the man who was so quiet, so unassuming, yet so utterly brilliant in his final protective maneuver. He was my anchor, and even in death, he had held me steady against the storm. Hayes slid the trust document across the table to me. I picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper, the weight of his foresight. My hand trembled. During the controlled chaos as the courtroom began to empty and Veronica's lawyers scrambled to mitigate the disaster, Hayes leaned close. He didn't offer a handshake or a hug, knowing my need for military formality in that moment. "Your father was a very smart man, Lieutenant," he murmured. "He told me years ago that if anything happened, he wanted to ensure your future was secure, beyond the reach of frivolous civilian interference. He utilized the system he understood best." I looked at him, my eyes still wet, and managed a nod. Words failed me. Instead, I stood, turned toward him, and executed a sharp, perfect military salute. It was the only way I could express the depth of my gratitude, not just for his legal skill, but for honoring my father's final wishes. Hayes returned the salute, his expression softening slightly. I watched Veronica being escorted out, her face a mask of shattered entitlement. She had tried to steal my life, my history, and my peace, but she had failed. Her arrogance was her undoing. She had underestimated the quiet strength of a man who spent his life serving, and the discipline of a daughter who followed in his footsteps. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright sunlight. The heavy burden I had carried for months finally lifted. I had secured my rightful inheritance, but more importantly, I had secured the memory of my father's integrity. The fight was over. My deployment was complete. I was finally, truly, home.